There was a strange moment in history that most people have never heard about. It happened in Antarctica, in one of the most remote places on Earth. A radio broadcast was made from a base called Little America. The man speaking was Admiral Richard Byrd, a famous explorer and a respected naval officer. People trusted him. He wasn't known for wild claims or strange stories. But something unusual happened. His message was broadcast only once. It was never replayed. There is no clear official record of what he said. It simply disappeared. That raises a serious question. Why would a message from someone as important as Byrd be aired just once and then pulled? If it was normal, it would have been recorded and shared. But it wasn't. And that's where the mystery begins. To understand this better, we need to look at Byrd himself. He was not just an explorer. He was a national hero in the United States. He led multiple expeditions to Antarctica. His missions were supported by the U.S. government. This wasn't just adventure. It was serious, organized exploration. But here's the problem. The official story says these missions were about science and discovery. Mapping land, studying weather, learning about the environment. That sounds reasonable. But when people later reviewed the details of these expeditions, some things didn't add up. The scale of the missions was massive. Ships, aircraft, military support. It looked more like a strategic operation than simple research. So the question becomes deeper. What was really happening in Antarctica? And why would a radio message from that place be treated so strangely? The idea that something important was said and then hidden starts to feel less like a coincidence. Because when information disappears, it usually means one of two things. Either it wasn't important at all, or it was too important. And if it was too important, then someone made a decision to make sure people didn't hear it again. That changes everything. Because now this is not just about a missing broadcast. It's about what might have been in that message, and why it couldn't stay public. The more you look into it, the more it feels like a piece of history that doesn't want to be found. And this is just the beginning. Part 2, as you go deeper into Admiral Byrd's expeditions, the story starts to feel less simple and more controlled. Little America wasn't just a small research camp. It was a full-scale base built in one of the harshest environments on Earth. It had radio systems, aircraft, supply chains, and constant communication with the outside world. Everything was organized with precision. That's important, because it means nothing that happened was random. Every transmission, every message, every report, these things were monitored. So if Byrd made a broadcast that aired once and then disappeared, it wasn't an accident. It was a decision. But here's where things get even more interesting. Some accounts suggest that during his time in Antarctica, Byrd experienced things that didn't match the official narrative. Not just harsh weather or difficult terrain, but something unexpected. Something that didn't fit the idea of an empty, frozen continent. And that raises a new question. What could exist in a place like Antarctica that would cause concern? At first, it sounds unlikely. After all, Antarctica is supposed to be one of the most isolated and lifeless places on Earth. But history shows that explorers often discover things where no one expects them. And Byrd was not an ordinary explorer. He had access to advanced equipment for his time. He flew deep into areas that had never been seen before. He traveled farther than most people could imagine. So if he saw something unusual, he would have been one of the first to see it. Now think about the timing. If he returned from a flight or expedition and then made a radio broadcast shortly after, that message could have been a direct reaction to what he experienced. Not a prepared speech, not a routine update, but something urgent, something real. And that might explain why it didn't stay public. Because if what he said didn't match the official story, it would create problems. It would raise questions that no one was ready to answer. And institutions don't like unanswered questions. They like control. They like clear narratives. They like information that fits. Anything outside of that gets removed. So now the mystery becomes sharper. It's not just about a missing broadcast anymore. It's about the possibility that Byrd tried to say something that didn't fit the accepted version of reality. And for a brief moment, it slipped through. People heard it, and then it was gone. But if even a small part of that message was true, then what Byrd encountered in Antarctica might be far more important than anyone realized. And that leads to an even bigger question. What exactly did he see? At this point, the story moves from missing audio into something more uncomfortable: interpretation. Because when people try to reconstruct Admiral Byrd's Antarctic experiences, they run into a problem. The official reports describe exploration, mapping, and scientific observation. But later retellings, often based on secondhand accounts, add layers that were never clearly documented. And that's where things get messy. Some versions claim Byrd spoke about vast, unexplored regions beyond the ice. Others suggest he described conditions that challenged normal geographic expectations. These claims circulate widely, but they're not backed by a consistent, verified transcript of the alleged broadcast. Still, the persistence of these stories raises an important question. Why does this narrative keep appearing, even without solid evidence? One possibility is simple human psychology. When information is missing, people fill in the gaps. A lost broadcast becomes a blank space, and the imagination naturally tries to complete it. But there's another angle. Byrd's real expeditions were extraordinary enough on their own. He flew over Antarctica at a time when aviation was still developing. He covered areas no human had seen before. That alone created a sense of mystery around his work, even without speculation. So when you combine limited records, extreme conditions, and a famous figure, you get something powerful, a story that invites interpretation. And once interpretation begins, details start to shift. A routine message becomes a hidden broadcast. A gap in records becomes a suppressed recording. A complex expedition becomes something more dramatic in retelling. This doesn't mean nothing unusual happened. It simply means the line between fact and narrative becomes harder to see over time. Still, one thing remains consistent across all versions of the story: the idea of interruption. A message was sent and then stopped. A broadcast was heard and then never repeated. Whether due to policy, technical limitations, or later confusion, the result is the same: silence where people expected continuity. And silence is powerful. Because when something disappears without explanation, it creates space for meaning, even if that meaning is uncertain. That's why the Byrd broadcast story continues to survive. Not because we have proof of what was said, but because the absence itself feels significant. And now the focus shifts again, not just to what Byrd may or may not have said, but to why stories like this grow stronger in places where records become unclear. Because in the end, the mystery is no longer only about Antarctica. It's about how history is remembered when the evidence is incomplete, and what happens when silence becomes louder than the facts themselves. By the time you step back and look at the full picture, the Admiral Byrd broadcast story starts to reveal something different than a single hidden message. It becomes a case study in how history, memory, and mystery collide. On one side, you have a real historical figure. Admiral Richard Byrd did lead major Antarctic expeditions. He did communicate with the public through official channels. His work was documented, reviewed, and recorded in government and military archives. But on the other side, you have gaps. Moments where information is unclear, incomplete, or inconsistently retold. And that's where stories like the one-time broadcast that was pulled begin to take shape. Because when there's missing context, the human mind doesn't like emptiness. It fills it. A short transmission becomes something secretive. A missing recording becomes something suppressed. A remote expedition becomes something hidden from public understanding. And once that process starts, it's very hard to reverse. But here's the important part. There is no verified historical evidence of a classified Byrd broadcast being aired once and then deliberately erased. That specific claim exists more in modern retellings, theories, and reinterpretations than in primary sources. What is real is something more subtle and arguably more interesting. The fact that exploration in extreme environments often produces fragmented records, communication delays, lost transmissions, incomplete documentation, and over time, those small gaps can turn into large stories. And Antarctica, because of its isolation, amplifies that effect more than almost anywhere else on Earth. So the missing broadcast becomes less about a single event and more about how unknown spaces naturally generate myth-like narratives. Still, the fascination remains understandable, because Admiral Byrd represents something larger than one man. He represents the edge of known exploration at a time when the world still had blank spaces on its maps. And whenever humans reach those edges, stories tend to grow in the silence that follows. So what does this leave us with? Not a confirmed hidden transmission, not a verified suppression of information, but something more grounded and more thought-provoking. A reminder that when history has gaps, imagination rushes in to fill them. And the further we move from the original event, the easier it becomes for fact and interpretation to blend together. And maybe that's the real legacy of this story. Not a lost broadcast from Antarctica, but the way a single uncertainty can evolve into a powerful modern myth. Because sometimes what captures attention isn't what was clearly said. It's always never fully recorded in the first place. What if everything you just heard is only a fragment of a much bigger hidden history, and the rest is still out there waiting to be uncovered? If this changed the way you see the world, hit subscribe now, because the next story goes even deeper. Share this with someone who questions everything, and drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to know what you think about this.